oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. Where you want to be is the purple line on the graph. On the vertical axis to the left is the percentage of oxygen saturation. Remember that oxygen saturation is the percentage of blood that is bound to hemoglobin. That's the number that you get when you put a pulse ox on a patient's finger. The horizontal line, the numbers on the bottom, is the PaO2, or the partial pressure of oxygen measured in millimeters of mercury. Let's recall that PaO2 is the pressure of oxygen that is dissolved in the blood. We said in the previous slide that oxygen saturation should be from 95 to 100 millimeters of mercury, and PaO2 should be at 80 to 100. This is why this matters. Let's take a look um, when your O2 sat is 90. Your PaO2 is only 60 millimeters of mercury. So just look at where those lines intersect at that purple line. So it's about 60. That is way below the 80, and that is not enough for your tissues. That is not enough oxygen for your tissues to use. At the 95% O2 sat, you reach a PaO2 of 80. So you really have to have almost perfect O2 saturation to achieve the minimum PaO2. The oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve diagram shows the effects of increases and decreases in O2 affinity at any PaO2 level. Affinity is that attraction to or a liking of something. I have an affinity to ice cream. I have an affinity to chocolate. In this case, how in love is your hemoglobin to oxygen? Decreased O2 affinity, also termed a shift to the right, this is when your hemoglobin is not so in love with oxygen. This releases oxygen from the hemoglobin molecule so easily. Your hemoglobin breaks up with its oxygen easier because it's not that attracted to it. This is good. That means that hemoglobin will give up its oxygen easily, so it moves oxygen from the blood to the tissues. That's what we want. This is not so great though. Remember that blood cells go to the lungs to pick up oxygen? Because hemoglobin is not that attracted to oxygen, it can pass right by the alveoli without picking up a tape. It goes right by without oxygen. Why is that bad? Because that blood cell with its empty hemoglobin molecules goes to the tissues and it's supposed to deliver oxygen, but it doesn't have any. Imagine you standing there waiting for your Amazon package that your app said is going to be delivered today, and there's a mailman just goes by without any package. Or you got a food delivery you're expecting. You are salivating, your stomach's growling, and the delivery guy shows up with no food, and you are starving. Same with your tissues. They get no love from the hemoglobin, no oxygen. On top of that, other blood cells who manage to pick up oxygen is just dropping off oxygen so easily everywhere. And so some tissues are getting more oxygen than others. So, what are the factors that shift the curve to the right? It includes acidosis, an increased PaCO2 in the blood. So, how do you get that? Remember that when you're breathing, when you breathe out CO2, right? So, what happens when you're not breathing enough? When your respirations are depressed, or you quit breathing altogether? That CO2 gets built up in your lungs and it causes acidosis. Other things that cause a shift to the curve to the right is hyperthermia or high fever. And then there's a thing called 2,3 biphosphoglycerate, 2,3-BPG. Sometimes you see it as DPG also. So if there's what is this exactly? It's an end product of RBC metabolism. It decreases hemoglobin's affinity or oxygen or attraction to oxygen. So we don't want that, right? Because remember that in this case, hemoglobin is already not that attracted to oxygen. And when you have more 2,3-BPG, it decreases that attraction even more. So now you've got all these hemoglobin blood cells running around and not really picking up any oxygen. So that's why you don't want that. What things can make the situation worse? So availability of oxygen is decreased by reduced cardiac output because you're not putting out enough blood. So not enough blood, not enough hemoglobin, and not enough hemoglobin to pick up oxygen, which again, hemoglobin's already not that attracted. So the cardiac output that you're putting out is not picking up oxygen that you need. Anemia kind of causes the same problem because you don't have enough blood cells. Your pulse oximetry will read low because the hemoglobin molecules don't always pick up oxygen. Increased affinity to oxygen is termed a shift to the left. It represents a tighter binding of oxygen to the hemoglobin molecule. A shift to the left is your hemoglobin really in love with oxygen. This is good because that helps loading of oxygen in the lungs. So every time that blood cell passes by the alveoli, its hemoglobin molecules will latch on and fill up with oxygen. So your oxygen saturation will always be high. This is bad though, because your hemoglobin is like an obsessive, possessive significant other. It refuses to break up. This impairs oxygen delivery to the tissues because hemoglobin, they go to the tissues, but it doesn't want to give up its oxygen. So even though the hemoglobin is fat with oxygen, increased for it, so even though the hemoglobin is fat with oxygen, its ineffective release in the tissues of oxygen may be a lot. So it's like your food delivery guy who shows up with bags of food but doesn't want to give it to you. So things that cause a shift to the left is alkalosis. So it's all the opposite of a shift to the right. So alkalosis, so you are not acidotic, you're alkalotic. Hypothermia, um, very low temperatures, decreased PaCO2 value. And remember that we said that when you're not breathing, you have more CO2 in your bloodstream. And so what would cause a decreased CO2 in your bloodstream? Hyperventilation would cause that because now you're breathing more CO2, right? And then a decreased 2,3 BPG concentration will also cause a shift to the left.